The evening in New York was especially gloomy. The streets of Manhattan were empty, with only a few pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalks, eager to get home. Liz, a young student, was returning home after a long day working at a cafe. Exhausted, she walked slowly along 3rd Avenue, planning to catch a taxi to avoid the long subway ride. The streets looked different this evening, almost deserted, with streetlights flickering in the thick fog. Liz spotted a lone taxi at the curb and raised her hand. The car smoothly pulled up, and she quickly got inside, closing the door behind her with relief. The driver, an elderly man with gray hair and tired eyes, turned to her and asked where to. 145th Street, please, Liz replied. The taxi started moving, and Liz settled comfortably in the back seat. It was warm inside the car, and she felt herself drifting off to sleep, relaxing after a hard day. However, a strange sensation interrupted her drowsiness after a few minutes. It felt like someone was watching her. Liz looked around, but there was no one in the car except her and the driver. She tried to calm herself, attributing her unease to exhaustion, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Liz glanced in the rearview mirror and suddenly noticed something strange. In the back seat right behind her, a blurry figure appeared. She immediately turned around but saw only an empty seat. Her heart began to race, and she leaned forward to the driver. Sir, do you see anyone in the back seat?" The driver glanced in the mirror and shook his head. "No, miss, there's no one there. Everything all right?" "Yes, probably just my imagination," Liz muttered, trying to calm down. But the sense of dread didn't go away. She looked in the rearview mirror again and saw that the blurry figure had become clearer. Now she could clearly see a female figure with long dark hair and empty, black eyes staring right at her. Liz felt cold sweat running down her back. "Stop the car. Stop, please," she screamed. The driver abruptly stopped by the curb, and Liz jumped out of the car, forgetting to pay. She stood on the street, breathing heavily and trying to collect herself. The taxi drove away, leaving her alone on the deserted street. Liz turned around and saw they had stopped near an old, abandoned building. She felt she needed to get away from there as quickly as possible. Liz started to walk away, but suddenly heard a whisper. It came from the abandoned building. She didn't want to go there, but her body moved on its own as if under hypnosis. The whisper grew louder and louder until it turned into a sinister howl. Liz entered the building and found herself in a dark corridor. The light from her phone's flashlight revealed only scraps of old wallpaper and mold on the walls. Suddenly, the light fell on an old mirror at the end of the corridor. Liz slowly approached it, and to her horror, saw the same woman from the taxi in the reflection. The woman stood right behind her, but when Liz turned around, no one was there. She looked in the mirror again, and the woman had moved closer. Her bottomless black eyes bored into Liz, and she heard an icy whisper directly in her mind, "You will never leave." Suddenly, the mirror shattered, and Liz felt a sharp pain in her chest. She looked down and saw that a shard of glass had deeply embedded itself in her body. The surroundings were dark, filled only with the sound of her labored breathing and pounding heart. Liz realized she was dying. In her final moments, her mind filled with visions, she saw herself in the same taxi, but with a different driver. He was young and smiling until he turned into a monster with empty eye sockets. She understood she had fallen into a trap from which there was no escape. In the morning, the police found her body in the abandoned building. No signs of violence, no obvious cause of death. Just a broken mirror and a shard of glass next to her. No one could explain what had happened to Liz that night, or why her heart had stopped in terror. Days passed, and the taxi driver reappeared on the streets of New York. He smiled at new passengers, inviting them into his car. But everyone who got into his taxi soon started seeing the woman with black eyes, and eventually they vanished without a trace. The city continued its life, unaware of the increasing number of missing people night after night. Only the shadows on the streets, flickering in the streetlights, testified to the presence of something sinister and unstoppable. Ellie had always loved visiting her grandmother in the small town of Rosewood. Tucked away from the bustling city, Rosewood had an old-world charm, with cobblestone streets, vintage shops, and a forest that seemed to stretch on forever. This summer, however, felt different. The town was unusually quiet, almost eerie, and a sense of foreboding hung in the air. It began with the disappearance of Mr. Thompson, the jovial owner of the local bakery. Ellie had fond memories of him handing her warm, freshly baked cookies each morning. But now, his shop was closed, and the sweet aroma of bread no longer filled the air. As Ellie walked past the shuttered windows, she couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching her. "People come and go, dear," her grandmother said dismissively when Ellie mentioned it. But Ellie's curiosity was piqued. She decided to investigate. One evening, she took a walk through the forest, hoping to clear her mind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path. Ellie had walked these trails countless times, but today they seemed unfamiliar, twisted and darker than usual. The trees whispered secrets she couldn't quite understand. As she ventured deeper, she stumbled upon an old, abandoned house. Its windows were broken, and the door hung ajar. Ellie felt a strange compulsion to enter. Pushing the door open, she was greeted by a musty smell and the creak of floorboards. Dust danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the gloom. Ellie explored the house, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. In what seemed to be the living room, she found an old photo album on a rickety table. Flipping through the pages, she saw familiar faces, townspeople she had known since childhood. But something was wrong. Each picture was dated, and underneath each date was another one, marked disappeared. A chill ran down Ellie's spine as she saw Mr. Thompson's picture. His disappeared date was recent. Her grandmother's photo was there too, with the same ominous notation, but it was a few years old. Ellie's heart pounded. What was going on? She heard a noise upstairs, a soft, shuffling sound. Gathering her courage, Ellie climbed the stairs. At the end of the hallway was a door slightly ajar, from which the noise emanated. She approached cautiously and peeked inside. The room was dimly lit by a single candle. In the corner, a figure huddled, its back turned to her. The figure was muttering something, a rhythmic chant that sent shivers down Ellie's spine. She stepped closer, trying to make out the words. The figure suddenly stopped chanting and turned around. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, eyes hollow with despair. Ellie gasped it was her grandmother. "Grandma," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. Her grandmother's eyes fixed on her, but they seemed empty, devoid of recognition. "Ellie," she croaked, "you shouldn't be here. What's happening? What is this place?" Ellie demanded, fear rising in her throat. Her grandmother's eyes flickered with a brief moment of clarity. "They're coming for you, Ellie. Just like they came for me." Before Ellie could ask who they were, the room grew colder. A shadow moved in the corner, and the air filled with a low, guttural growl. Ellie's grandmother screamed, a sound filled with such terror that it echoed through the house. The shadows converged, forming a dark, menacing shape. Ellie felt an icy grip on her shoulder and spun around. There was no one there, but the grip tightened, pulling her back. She struggled, but the force was too strong. As she was dragged down the hallway, she caught glimpses of other figures in the rooms, all chanting, all with the same hollow eyes. The force pulled her towards the basement. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The basement door swung open, and Ellie was thrown down the stairs. She landed hard, pain shooting through her body. The basement was dark, but she could see faint outlines of other people, lost souls who had been taken by whatever malevolent force ruled this town. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices a haunting chorus. Ellie backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in, and she felt herself being pulled into the darkness. As she lost consciousness, the last thing she heard was the eerie chanting, now a part of her own mind. When Ellie didn't return, the townspeople whispered among themselves, their faces pale with fear. Another disappearance, another soul taken by the forest. Rosewood continued its silent existence, each resident living in fear of the day they might be next. And deep in the forest, the old house stood, its secrets hidden within its walls. Those who dared to enter would find the photo album. Now, with Ellie's picture, Mark disappeared. The town remained silent, a place where the past lingered and shadows held sway, waiting for their next victim.